Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Martin Tyson. I'm the head of regulation improvement at OSCR. But today, what I'm doing is on behalf of the Scottish Third Sector Governance Forum. And what we're going to talk about today is embracing hybrid working. Might have been better to put a question mark after that and say embracing hybrid working. And I'm joining you from my sofa in downtown Kirkcaldy, which obviously is a case in point. It's a long time since I've been back into OSCR's offices in Dundee. By the look of the pictures that are coming up here, a lot of other people are joining us from home. So what we're wanting to do today is really to explore what that's meant for charities and charity trustees. We've got with us today, we've got Stephanie Fraser, who is the Chief Executive of Cerebral Palsy Scotland and also a board member at the Scottish Charity Regulator. And we've got John Fitzgerald, who's, as well as being Digital Evolution Manager at the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, is a trustee of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We've got subtitles enabled here if anyone needs those. If you're having trouble accessing those, maybe you can get on the chat and Paula will help you with that. We're recording the meeting. You should have had a message coming up about that when you logged in there, and hopefully that's okay with everyone. The reason for that is so that we can share this and hopefully share the value with people in the future. We've got the chat enabled there, so if people have questions that sort of come up through the session here, make sure those don't get lost. Put those in the chat, and Paula will make sure that I and John and Stephanie are alerted to these, so we can maybe discuss those at the end. What we're going to do is really that John and Stephanie and I are going to really have a conversation about what the experience of the pandemic and the ways of working that have come out of that have meant for their charities, and particularly for the folks that work in the charities, and specifically the charity trustees, how that's evolved, and at the end, I think maybe what the future might be like. It seems a good time to get together and talk about these experiences and the way ahead for charities and trustees. I was going to say as we emerge from the pandemic, but maybe it's truer to say as we sort of move through the various phases of the pandemic. For a lot of people, the world of work and the experience of running organisations has changed a lot since March 2020, and this clearly applies to charities. Many of us are working from home, many of us are meeting online and interacting in person only sporadically, if that. Many offices are empty, trains and buses are running half empty. The commuting has hugely reduced. That said, it's important to recognise that this isn't true for everyone. There's a lot of people, particularly in frontline services, who are still delivering and working face to face. And perhaps one of the things we'll talk to is how to manage that sort of blend. Thinking about the diversity of the sector in Scotland, the experience of charities and trustees will have been very varied. So what I'd like to do in the conversation is to explore that experience in two quite different charities that John and Stephanie are involved in, reflect on what that's been like, think about what the future might hold, and then open up for discussion with all of you about what your experiences have been and what your reflections are. So, just to get us rolling, what I was wondering, maybe Stephanie, if I come to you first, how about setting the scene for us? To tell us how Cerebral Palsy Scotland operated before the start of the pandemic. What was it like in March 2020?
Well, we weren't called Cerebral Palsy Scotland in March 2020. We had a long-term plan to rebrand, and had chosen the start of the financial year, 1st of April 2020. I mean, the April Fool was clearly on us. So we were called BOBAS Scotland, and in March 2020, we were celebrating 25 years of being BOBAS Scotland and moving towards our rebrand. The rebrand was really designed to enable people to find us more easily, to do what we say on the tin. So we help people in Scotland with cerebral palsy. What we were finding in March was that this was a population that was highlighted very, very early on in the pandemic as being vulnerable. So people with cerebral palsy were being mentioned by government as early as the 16th of March as having to take extra measures. So there was a huge, very, very quickly, there was a huge amount of anxiety amongst our population. So just to set the scene a little bit, we provide face-to-face services. So we have physios, OTs, speech and language therapists that work from here. We provide services from our centre in Glasgow, which is where I am now, but we also did a lot of work across the country. So teams would be, I mean, actually, we just had a team who had come back from Aberdeen at the beginning of March. So, you know, retrenching back to Glasgow was the sort of first step that happened. And also dealing with this very increased anxiety. So that was even before lockdown was announced, that's where we were.
Okay. And in general, how did your trustees, go about their business, at that point? Well, did they?
Yeah, we'd had a board meeting in February, and our February board meeting is normally our planning meeting. So we start to look at strategy, and February. We have a sort of vague calendar of what the trustees are going to look at throughout the year. And February is very much a planning, looking forward strategy meeting. And I have to say, we did look at our risk register, and we did have global pandemic on it, because we were beginning to kind of think about what was coming out of China and what was happening in, but I mean, I feel very smug telling you that. It would have been quite normal for us to have a risk register and not have anything about public health or anything like that on it. But other than that, I have to say, we didn't see what was coming down the track. So we were face-to-face meeting at pre-arranged times, and dealing with each other via email or phone calls as necessary, as in between was where we were.
Okay, great. And John, can you set the scene for us about the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust? How did you operate, and how did the pandemic come at you?
Of course, yeah. So Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust is a medium to large independent foundation. We grant about £10 million a year to social justice and peace and a variety of different organisations. And we have a staff team of about 20. Our main office is in York. And as a grant maker, one of the main things we want to be able to do is get information and insight about our grantees and their work, so we can make good decisions and back the right people and the right projects. So before the pandemic, that involved a lot of travelling, so a lot of meetings down in London, lots of time on the train. And for our grantees as well, they were coming to physically meet with us at grant assessment stages, and the various grant subcommittees. Trustees would spend a lot of their time travelling to get to meetings. So I think we had a regular quarterly board meeting on and around the 19th of March. That was just at the point that the lockdown was beginning. And that became a kind of last minute hybrid meeting where a lot of trustees were expected to travel but didn't for various reasons. So we had to do that at very short notice. It kind of worked. It wasn't perfect. It's interesting that Stephanie mentions risk registers, because remember, our risk dashboard was kind of bright red across quite a few rows at that stage, just because of things we needed to take action on and adapt to very quickly. But we recognise that was probably a very common scenario for charities, where a lot of your assumptions about what you can do and what you need to attend to really change overnight. Okay. In terms of adaptation, we found we were able to meet more frequently as trustees, meeting online, but we also found we had to be more focused on what we were talking about. Actually, in the past year, we've the main thing we did as a kind of pandemic response was increase our spend, because we recognised that grantees would be facing pressures. So people that were existing grantees got extensions where they were needed. And we also made a few other funding decisions to kind of basically try and buoy up bits of the sector as pressures came on. And the other thing we did as a big piece in the last year was expand our staff team. This was part of a longer term plan anyway, to kind of deal with more activity. And that has gone well in a lot of respects, but we recognise it's been more difficult for new staff members to join the organisation where we're not meeting face to face, because I think face to face meetings are often where you get to know people in a more rounded sense, and it's not just talking about what's on the agenda at a particular time.
So I'm interested there. What you're talking about is some in that early part of the pandemic, are some very sort of chunky decisions getting taken. You know, that you've upped the funding, you've sort of upped the staffing there. And what did that mean for the trustees, and how did the sort of constraints of having to meet remotely, how did that play out in terms of making those decisions?
I think so. One thing we talk about amongst ourselves is we're a responsive funder, so we kind of rely on our grantees and expert co-optees to help us understand the context and how it's changing. I can remember one of the first board meetings as the pandemic arrived and lockdown began. I think there was definitely a sense of how flexible do we need to be, and then as we had subsequent meetings, we realised we needed to be adapting much more quickly. And I think the fact that we knew each other well as trustees meant that we could kind of have those discussions at good pace. And I think that although the online meeting format is very novel for us, a lot of the other practices we have as trustees in terms of how we put an agenda together, how we deliberate, that kind of thing was already familiar. So I think that's very helpful.
Okay.
We had a slightly different, I mean, obviously we had a slightly different experience because we're not a funder, we are a service deliverer.
Yes.
And in terms of, therefore, decisions trustees had to make very quickly, there was a number of things. There was how do we help our beneficiaries, which clearly needed to be different to how we had been helping them before lockdown. And how do we what's in the best interest of our organization. Now, they may not be the same. You know, the best interest of the organization and the best interest of the beneficiaries may be two different things. And you know, what we ended up discussing was, you know, what were the essential services that people with cerebral palsy needed that we could do online. You know, that March to June 2020 bit where all you could do was online. And therefore, you know, the trustees were looking at, I mean, the furlough scheme was a godsend, absolute godsend. You know, but we were looking at, we did things like we cancelled all our direct debits. You know, the treasurer said to me, if people want their money, they can come and ask for it. We can pay it, but you know, we need to look at the cash that we've got in the business. So, John, you're right. Funders were amazing, but we didn't know that at the beginning that you were all going to be amazing and more flexible. So, looking at what was the cash coming in and out was really important. Making use of schemes like the furlough scheme, and we actually also applied for a CBILS loan, which we haven't touched, but the trustees made the decision to apply for it and to keep it, because in these emergency situations, cash is king.
Maybe just explain a little bit about what that is, Stephanie. Maybe not everyone's familiar with that.
So the furlough scheme was obviously the government's job retention scheme, which allowed us to keep it prevented us from having to make any redundancy decisions. The CBILS loan was the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, which was the government's you know, basically years free, apply through your bank cash. So our trustees, as I say, were having because we didn't know how the funders were going to react. We didn't know what the services were that we could provide, which is normally what we go out to funders to ask them to fund. There was this dual discussion going on about how do we help the beneficiaries and how do we ensure that the organization survives. And we moved quickly to Zoom meetings. It started off with one of the trustees had a personal Zoom account and he sent around the invitation to the trustees. It's obviously moved on to Cerebral Palsy Scotland now have a Zoom account, but we have also brought new trustees in during this time, because it also got to the point where we were thinking we were going to bring new trustees on anyway. Why wouldn't we? And so we have 2 trustees that haven't met the rest of the board in person.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of things going on probably very quickly there. There's, some major risks to deal with. You have, a trustee body that's getting used to, working remotely. Do you have a sense of what that felt like for the trustees?
I think in one way it was convenient. People were able to attend meetings, so we had a fantastic attendance at board meetings, and we had a few extra board meetings to deal with specific things. I think it was difficult for the new trustees because John was saying that his board knew each other well and knew how to take decisions, whereas we had new people that hadn't met everybody, because we'd had 2 new trustees before we went online. I think it was really challenging for the chair, because I think chairing a meeting online is a wholly different experience to sitting in a room and chairing, and actually just keeping an eye out for who wants to put their hand up or come in, or and we all had to, in anything we did, we all had to get used to being on mute, putting our hands up, looking for the chat box or whatever it is. And I think so for the chair, I think it was especially challenging to make the meetings include everybody and have the right kind of discussions. And I don't know whether you want me to go on to, we did our entire audit online.
Okay,
so,
and what was that like?
So that was we were very keen to get the audit done quickly and not to wait. I know that OSCR were actually being very supportive and some auditors just weren't able to do the audits in time. So there was a problem with that. Our auditors, I have to say, were excellent. They already had an online portal for uploading documents, so we did as much as we could on that. And then I actually came into the centre and loaded up physically a load of files and handed over to the poor auditor who took it away in his car to go and look. And that was sort of only physical interaction that happened. But actually it was remarkably smooth. And I think it was very important to the trustees to get the accounts done, because we also realised with the year end of the 31st of March that whatever accounts we had weren't going to be remotely relevant to the world we now lived in. So let's get them done, let's get them out, and let's actually get the trustees' report talking about, okay, here's where we were, and so our sort of going concern and our future plans in the trustees' report became much, much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just bring John in on that? Some of what you said there. I'm thinking particularly about the experience of chairing online meetings, John.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what the challenges were from your point of view?
Yeah, so I think,
or your chair's point of view.
Yeah. So I chair a subcommittee, so I had some experience of that. And I think, as Stephanie says, you're not able to read body language. There might be, particularly with a board member you know well, if they're across the table from you, you can tell whether they're content or skeptical or whatever it might be. That can be difficult. I think we have found, particularly in our subcommittees where we're bringing in external expertise, is that can often be more inclusive, because if you've got somebody who's got caring responsibilities or they're juggling into their professional life, they can maybe more easily make an online meeting than one where they have to travel to London or York. So that's a benefit. But I think we do see it can be more tiring. You know, if you did a 4 or 5 hour face-to-face meeting, that would be tiring. If you're trying to do something near that length online, it would be really exhausting. And I think we do find, like Stephanie, we brought on new trustees in the year, and I think it has been tricky for them because they've obviously been part of all the discussions we've been having, but there's not been that chance to really get to know the other board members. And, you know, often that kind of traveling together with another board member can be a chance to understand a bit more about what's going on. I think we find you can get through material, but often you can feel like there's not spaces and time to kind of really understand how trustees are feeling about an issue.
Okay.
And yeah.
What we found is that's really important if you're working on or having an online meeting is that trustees get the issues and the papers in enough time so that they can come back and ask. So if there are some tricky, you know, decisions that you want them to make, or something that you know, it's been really important to ensure that the trustees understand what is the point of this meeting, why are we meeting, and what do we need from you, and what information do you need from us, the staff, to give you so that you can make your decisions in an informed way. Because what we found is that often the conversation isn't in the meeting like it would be if we were all sitting around a table. It's people reading things in advance and saying and wanting to ask their question that way. And so actually, you know, in sending things out in advance has been even more important. Martin will know that I'm slightly obsessed with that anyway, with the OSCR board papers, but actually, fun enough, during this, it's become even more important.
Indeed, yeah. There's some really interesting points coming out there. So I hear what you're saying, that it's really important what happens around the meeting, because almost that you're not getting the cues and the body language and almost all the sort of kind of value and density of experience that you would get from meeting face to face. And there needs to be more happening around the meeting. But what are the governance challenges of that, if there are sort of discussions going on beforehand, maybe afterwards, and around the papers? How do you sort of keep that nice and tight in terms of governance?
Well, I think that's the chair, you know, so that it's alerting issues to the chair, or the CEO or whoever it is. You know, or sometimes it's just going back to the person that wrote the paper for explanation, you know, but if it's a big issue, so, you know, I have been in a meeting, which is another board I'm on, it's not OSCR, don't worry, where actually one trustee fundamentally did not agree with the rest of the decision. And it was very important that the chair gave time for that viewpoint to be heard and for the rest of the board to decide, you know, do we agree? You know, the trustee needed to feel heard and noted. I have to say he wasn't persuaded to the majority of the rest of the board, but the decision was taken as a majority decision. So I think that's back to the chairing becomes a really important role. And I think, you know, I do sometimes think sometimes we take our chairs for granted and we don't give them enough credit for sort of teasing out these things as they need to be teased out. Okay.
John, are you aware of any sort of challenges along those lines, that particularly in terms of that being able to absorb the information early enough before meetings?
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question, that, because I think it kind of cuts both ways. So we're using digital board papers way before the pandemic. For about 5 or 6 years now, we've used iPads because we get these huge packets which aren't just agendas of items, but also papers, supporting applications and that kind of thing. So that's been a part of the landscape for a while. And I think a bonus for that is you can reliably get material to trustees quickly. So that's a bonus. But I think one disadvantage is there's potentially no upper limit on how long papers can be. So that can be challenging. And also, I think with a kind of a paper board packet or something, you'll have very firm deadlines, which I think you will never breach, because you think, well, this physically has to get into a board member's, will get eaten by their dog, whatever happens to board papers. The other thing that's a funny personal thing is I'm a Scottish-based trustee of a mostly England-based organisation. So I always had the luxury of the second read through papers on the train, which is often quite clarifying. You know, you do your main reading to kind of say what's here, but then you can look at things a second time, which was a nice luxury. Of course, I always used to find when I'd finished the meeting and was on the train back home, I wish I didn't have to go on the train. You can snap your fingers and get there. But there's that. And I think we find in the pandemic, there's been issues that have come up that we've had to deal with. What we've done sometimes, if it's been a very big discussion, is maybe had 2 goes at it. So we're maybe meeting a fortnight apart to kind of open up a discussion and then settle on a final approach, and that's been helpful. And I think board members have been good with email, actually. I think putting good questions across on email can sometimes gather useful insight. But I think, as Stephanie says, if you've got a really good chair, they can then bring that kind of questioning into the room. So as an item's introduced, it's not, not about kind of shooting down a paper or a perspective, but just saying, like, some people have been asking questions, can we talk about that as we introduce the item and that kind of thing.
Okay, great. Okay, so just moving forward with the story a little, you talked about that immediate sort of shift into that first lockdown and how you started working. How did your ways of working evolve over the last, was it now 18 months? It's amazing saying that, isn't it? How have things evolved since then? Have things got easier? Obviously we're out of the sort of furlough now, Stephanie, and that will have changed things and more decisions to make. So how has it evolved?
Well, I think we had our AGM in September, and we actually had it as a hybrid meeting. So we had some of the trustees in the centre and some of the trustees on Zoom. And I was really concerned about how that was going to work, because pre-pandemic, I've always felt if I've been in a meeting where some have been in the room and some have been down the line, that the people down the line have been second-class citizens. During the pandemic, we were all online, so that was all fine. But I was really concerned about how it would work, and actually, it worked really well. I think what we found is that the technology has moved on so much. So before, you could only have hybrid meetings if you had very expensive equipment, and you had VC facilities or something, which lots of charities just didn't have. Whereas now we've all got Zoom or Teams or whatever. I think the one tip I would have is that we do have a screen, but I mean, a white wall would have done. So we projected those that were down the line, they were on the big screen. And that really helped, because that really felt that they were around the table with us. But we were basically just using Zoom. And actually, I asked some trustees who weren't in the room, was it as good for you as it felt like for us? And they said it was fine. And I think we will be continuing with that, because, for example, we have not only the travel aspect, but we have, for example, a consultant, an NHS consultant on our board. And actually, if she's on call, she could Zoom in from the hospital whereas otherwise she'd have to send her apologies. So we'd rather have her with us than not with us. So I think that's going to be one of the things that we will keep for the future.
And you mentioned your AGM there, and forgive me, I can't remember. Do you have a membership?
No. We don't.
Right. Okay. Because yeah, obviously that'd be interesting in terms of communicating with members, and obviously you've got a sort of staff, quite a large sort of staff group, and I'm just interested, in terms of the trustees' sort of relationship with that staff group, where previously they might have been coming in and out the office, for meetings, and having those kind of casual conversations with staff. How has that sort of progressed? I think
the thing is that we went from rabbits in a headlight, everybody trying to sort of do their best at the beginning, to we actually opened our services for face-to-face from July 2020, week of the 13th of July 2020, on a very we're restricted by healthcare regulations and things like that. And actually that is how we've been operating in a hybrid way from then on. So from a staff team, if you are delivering face-to-face critical services, you're able to come in. If you're able to do your work from home, please do it from home, is where it's been. What that has meant is that 18 months down the line, actually, people are working in silos. I don't know whether others, I'm looking at all your faces, I don't know whether others are finding this in their organizations, but people are able to do their job. So for example, our fundraisers are able to sit in their houses and write a fundraising application. But does it feel like our fundraising application? Are they picking up, what's happening to the people we are fundraising for? Whereas before, you could be making a cup of tea, look out at our car park and see somebody struggling to get in and out of a car in the rain with their equipment or whatever it might be, that would lead you to kind of, I think, write a better fundraising application. So I think there is a real sense, and I'm getting this from the staff, of just feeling unconnected. And I think that's the same with the board. So we've actually got our next board meeting is on the 11th of November. So is that next week? It is next week, isn't it? And actually it will be a hybrid meeting, but we are bringing very deliberately different members of staff to talk about how they feel to that board meeting. In normal times, we would have had a staff board away day type thing, but we haven't been able to do that now for 2 years. So there is this feeling about what does the organisation that is now called Cerebral Palsy Scotland, what does that mean to be part of that? And I think that's the thing. I can't give you a glib answer. I can only say that we are aware it's an issue and we need to find ways of bringing people together again.
Yeah, no, I think that sense of people starting to operate maybe in their own bubbles, as it were, is something I've heard from a lot of people. John, how have things evolved for the trust?
Good question. So in some ways, not much. So we've not really changed our online approach very much. I think we've all become more comfortable with it, which has been good, but it's there and it's working. I was talking to a chief exec recently, and staff are actually quite keen to come back. So the approach we're taking with that, because our work can be done remotely, it's fine if people want to do that. So we've not adopted a policy of saying let's all go back, but our staff on a voluntary basis have been quite keen to do that. And I think that is about getting back to that collegiate atmosphere and having a chance to have conversations. Because although our grant programs are distinct, they're also quite cross-cutting as well. So there's a kind of sense we like to try and do things as a whole organisation. So I think people are looking to get the chance to have that awareness. And our next board meeting in late November will be a hybrid one with most people in person, if that works. Some people joining online. So I think there is that recognition of let's find opportunities to kind of get face to face and have those discussions when we can, even though we can do the basics quite well in terms of doing the work and sharing information. And I think that for us, I think it'd be a very interesting one with grantees. So when we're about to make a grant, we go and have a face-to-face chat with them. I think one of the big challenges is there's not a norm or a default. So prior to the pandemic, we would have had very, very occasional times where we might have done a video meeting if that really enabled discussion with a grantee that couldn't happen otherwise, but it was very exceptional. People's experience the last 18 months has been very, very much online. And we know that some grantees may say, well, look, we'd like to be face-to-face, but others may not. And then it's a kind of, how do you navigate that? Because what we don't want to do is put people under pressure to do things that they wouldn't want to do otherwise. But yeah.
So, what's your feeling about that way, or what's the feeling in the organisation? Is there a value that's lost by not having that face-to-face relationship with your grantees?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we try to do as a funder is support work that's quite risky that may not otherwise happen. And I think when you're doing that, really knowing your grantees well is really important, because then if something comes up that may cause problems down the line, they talk to you early about it rather than wait for it to become a big difficulty. And one funny thing that comes up sometimes with a grantee initial meeting is understanding the dynamics in the team in the room. So, what you wouldn't want to see is a kind of one colleague kind of dominating a discussion where other colleagues are not really saying very much. And I think that's probably easier in person because you can sort of see if somebody's biting their lip. So yeah, there's kind of nuances that are there. And I think also, for me, particularly if you're doing a day of seeing a lot of grantees, if you're meeting in person, you'd have that time like a job interview panel would do to kind of come back together and say, well, what do we make of that? And another trustee has said to me, she said, one problem with online meetings, it's very hard to remember what was being discussed because no context, it's not like that time we were in London seeing those people. It's like that time I was in my bedroom talking to my computer again.
So, well, we're lacking the landmarks. One thing runs into
there's a kind of some landmarks are missing. So yeah.
So do you think, how far do you feel that as trustees and as an organisation as a whole, you've now got a kind of settled way of working?
So I'd probably say not settled right now, because I think this hybrid or mixed working will become more prevalent, and it'll just be interesting to see how that works. I think we're probably maybe going to get to a point where we'll look at the kind of the balance sheet of pluses and minuses. So like a big plus is we've got trustees who are parents of young children, and they've been able to be much more involved and attend much more without the pressures that they would have had if they were physically coming across to York. That's a plus. But also what are we losing? What do we need to get back to? And it's kind of about understanding what those are.
Yeah. Okay. And Stephanie, are you feeling that Cerebral Palsy Scotland has a settled way of working now, or do you think do you see it evolving? And if so, how quickly and where to?
No, I think not at all. I know the trustees are desperate to have a strategy day or a strategy discussion. And actually, it was our chair that was kind of saying, until we can get face to face, he's very loath to do that. Our strategy was to survive and to help our beneficiaries. What can we do for our beneficiaries, and how do we keep going? Was the strategy up until kind of fairly recently. And what we've found now is that we are now in a position where the plans we had pre-pandemic to do stuff as we became Cerebral Palsy Scotland didn't happen. And they're not necessarily the right plans to happen now, because the world has changed. So in terms of, for example, our staff structure, it's not quite right. We've had various challenges, with people, people leaving or doing different things or wanting to do different things. We haven't been able to travel as much as we would have done before. And actually knowing when that's going to, every plan we make at the moment has to have a sort of COVID contingency just in case somebody can't do it, or somebody has to isolate, or, you know. So do I think we're in a settled place? No. Mm-hmm. Do we need to talk about the long-term future? Absolutely we do, and we're beginning the board is beginning to look at that. But what we're finding is that we can probably plan for next year, and we can probably tell you where we want to be in 5 years' time. But between next year and 5 years, there is a massive sort of looking through a glass darkly, and that's the challenge.
Okay, I mean that's really interesting, and you know that there's bits that I very much recognise as well, you know, organisationally. Just you know, you were talking about being in survival mode there, and I think again that'll strike a chord with a lot of people. But you know, is it possible yet to kind of sum up what the if you like the impact and that broader sort of organizational tool has been, you know, what the sort of cost and the impact and the need just to be resilient has done?
I think what it's meant is that a lot that some people have taken on a lot of things in their roles. Oops, have I frozen? Or no, you're back. Fine. All right, sorry, I thought I just had a glitch. There we go, live technical example of the challenges. Some people have taken on roles which their original job descriptions bear no resemblance to. So, you know, there needs to be a little bit of unpacking about who do we need doing what, and whose skills are best employed where. And that's been a kind of result of some people being on furloughs, some people are having to do, you know, some people have done over and above and, you know, haven't had a proper break. We've got a heck of a lot of annual leave that has been carried forward, you know, that is really challenging to have to manage, and everybody's got to manage it before the end of March, for example. You know, but it's that who does what and why are they doing that? You know, we always come back to the why. Why is this person doing that? And just because they used to do it like that doesn't mean that's the right thing for them to be doing it like that now. And similarly in our services, you know, we had our, if you like, our menu of services that we used to do. But in a hybrid world, you know, we now see everybody digitally first. It's either like this or a phone call or you know, there's a digital contact first. That's just the norm. But that has meant that the backup and the admin of everything, we just need a little bit of change of headspace. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. John, just I'll put the same question to you. What do you think the sort of impact and the organisational cost has been?
Well, I think one sort of thing I would highlight is we're a lot more resilient than you might expect. So, you know, if you travel back to the time machine and said to somebody in January 2020, right, you won't be able to go into your office, you'll be able to do all of these things, you might say, well, we couldn't possibly operate in those circumstances, but actually, like most organizations, people find ways of making things work. I think it has been hard work. So I think the thing we'd come back to is it's not just we've all chosen to not be in offices, it's been all the pandemic pressures that have been around have been there too, and that can be in people's family lives or whatever it might be. There's huge like challenges to deal with, so it's kind of recognizing that. And I think the other thing is, you know, with a kind of weighing up home working, there are going to be some staff members who think, well, actually I really need to be back in the office because that's a much better place for me to be and to work, and we can't assume that, you know, it's never a planned move, so you can't really say, oh well, we'll just let it settle as the default. So it's kind of taking that time to evaluate. I think for us it's all really about kind of contact time with grantees and as trustees, and like finding sort of efficient ways to do that, but making sure it's quality discussions. Like there are some kind of items or areas where you can't just do it in a kind of short focused online session, you need more time together. So think about ways to get back to that. And I think the other thing for us as a funder is just kind of keeping abreast of the longer term impacts of the pandemic. You know, we've made some quick responses in the last 18 months, but we know that things will continue to be difficult for the sector, so kind of keeping aware of that as it moves on.
Well, listen, I'm really grateful to you both, John and Stephanie, for I think, really sort of taking us through, quite vividly what the challenges were there, and for sharing so much of that with us. What I'm wanting to do now is really sort of open up to the rest of the folks that are on the call, and just see whether there are other experiences that people have to share. I think particularly in other sort of parts of the sector, or in smaller charities, I'd be really interested to find out how what the impact's been like there, and just whether anyone has any sort of questions for John and Stephanie, if they wanted to speak up or put those into the chat. We have a question there from Shirley. And this is a point that occurred to me actually. Do Stephanie or John have any hints about support or training for boards to help with cultural change about online working? I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Shirley. Oh, I think you're still muted. Oh, you're muted again.
Yes, just to highlight, as Stephanie said, the realities. It is an assumption I'm making that adjusting to not just hybrid working, but to the online world isn't just the same as teaching, say, roles and responsibilities and people's grasp and understanding and practice. There is something else about being in a different world, talking in different ways. So I'm making that assumption that for many boards to realize this very useful sense of balance that John and Stephanie have given us is culture change. It's not just knowing how to thing. The other bit is, as you said, with many organizations that I work with who are small, at times I'm aware I'm talking to people on their mobile phone. It isn't as straightforward as having a laptop. So and often they are very stalwart and they do what they can, but it's hard. Yeah. So there's just some things I wanted to raise. Otherwise, I'm feeling much warmer about embracing than I was before. So thank you.
Great. John, Stephanie, have you got any thoughts, first of all, on that cultural point?
I think.
Go, Stephanie.
Sorry, no, I should let you go first, John, because I'm not sure I've got any great points, because I saw Shirley's question in the chat, and so I've been thinking about. I mean, I think you're right about it's a different space, and I think what's really important for any group that meet together regularly to do is to understand what, if you like, the etiquette of whatever their meeting is, and I don't think that's any training or anything, but I think having an honest discussion about how the chair or whoever wants to run the meeting is quite helpful. So for example, some people find endless putting in the chat completely distracting, and they can't monitor it and look at all of you at the same time. Some people still are struggling with coming on mute or not on, we all do it. But I mean, they can't, people, if you're on your mobile phone, it's not your fault. I've joined with people being in their cars with them. I mean, not driving, I might say, in a car park, but people do struggle with unstable signal, all that kind of stuff. So what's the etiquette? How are you not going to feel left out if that's you, or how are you as the chair going to cope with that? And I would recommend just there needs to be a discussion amongst that group, if it's a group that meets regularly, about what works for you. So for us, the thing I mentioned about being able to, really encouraging people to comment on papers in advance is helpful. There's something I chair where I'm absolutely insistent that we try and understand what the purpose of the meet, why are we meeting? What is the point of getting us all to look at our computers for an hour? And if you can come to the meeting knowing what's expected of you, then I think that's that would be my tip.
Great. John, what are your thoughts on that and etiquette, culture?
A few things. So I think the first thing I'd say is there's no consultants out there with expertise, because expertise is just experience. So the more online meetings you do, the more experienced you'll be as a group. And I think, as Stephanie says, that's being a bit reflective and thinking what's working and what isn't, and articulating it is really helpful. And I think I've seen some American consultants have been quite good on this. I think because in the States, they have had virtual meetings a bit longer because they're East and West Coast and that kind of thing. Some of it can feel quite cheesy because it's all about kind of saying things that we reserved folk probably wouldn't want to say. But it's interesting to reflect on that process, kind of articulating as you're going along, what we're trying to do here, let me bring so and so in. I think a big one with hybrid meetings would be asking the remote participants first for their input, because once the in-room discussion gets going, they can often end up stuck in the back seat. And I think there's probably a piece around like board digital skills, because, you know, historically, if you're recruiting for board members, you'd be looking for people with experience, with insight, with good judgment, able to read a lot of stuff, able to make your regular meeting times, that kind of thing. Now it's a bit about getting those skills so you feel comfortable. They're not a really daunting set of skills, but they're still useful to have. And I think, yeah, it's about just articulating it a bit. So as you start each meeting, just a quick reminder, but also one thing we've done in our, probably for the first half dozen or so, was we used a chat at the end to do a quick summing up of how people found it. So we asked what worked well, what was a problem, what are you unsure about? And people just, one thing we did to reduce distraction was everybody typed their answer but didn't hit send. And then you hit send at the same time, so you got a big kind of stream of stuff. That reduced distraction and made it kind of anonymous as well, so people felt able to be braver. And then we saved that and reviewed it. So myself and the staff member would review, right, what were we seeing from people about this experience? And I think that's helpful, because that just helps build the expertise more quickly, because you're just being more conscious about what you're doing and what the outcomes were in terms of experience.
Okay. Okay, that's one I'm scribbling down. I might use that one. That sounds really good. Just one thing I want to pick up, and I think it came out in you know, what you both had to say, and it's really about around sort of well-being and you know, well-being of I think of staff in particular, but I think trustees as well. You know, you talked about people working in you know, maybe starting to work in silos and you know, the challenges of you know, being on your own and not being in the room with people. And I'm just wondering if folks who are on the call have any thoughts about that and you know, the challenges, but also ways of supporting you know, well-being of trustees or staff or volunteers. When we're in this way of working, whether anyone has any experiences to share there.
I mean, while people are thinking of their experiences, I think it's really important to realize that, you know, if you and your organization are finding resilience issues around staff having to take on extra things, I think it's always important to remember that trustees have had to do that too. You know, so this whole kind of, you know, governance, how do we do this in this new world change? You know, it's a huge responsibility. And I think, you know, I mean, I appreciate our board members here hugely, but I probably don't tell them that enough.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, John?
One thing I think I've been aware of is the danger of like what you might call the digital iceberg. So when we're in an online meeting like this, it feels like I know a lot about your context, so I can see what color your wallpaper is, that kind of thing. So it's got, you know, it feels like, you know, I understand where Martin's coming from. But actually, if you're sitting in a video call, you're actually quite guarded, really. You know, there's no body language there about, right, is he actually wanting to be somewhere else? Am I being quite boring? All those kind of things. And so I think one of the challenges is there's a feeling of, oh, well, I've been talking to a staff member, a fellow trustee quite a lot, and I know what's going on. but actually maybe not in the way that you might have done if you just had a quiet moment in a board meeting break, or just happened to be around the office for a wee while and that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing to think about. And I think the other one is the kind of potentially infinite availability. So before digital meetings, you say, right, well, I can make that meeting in London, but I can't then do that other one in Belfast, or there's a finite piece of time. And I think with digital, there's a bit of a temptation to think, well, we could squeeze a quick meeting in. And I think particularly for trustees, what you might do is say, well, we could do a 90-minute session on a weekday evening, but you need to remember your trustees probably spent a long day earning their day job salary, doing all the other things they're doing, and they might not be bringing their best selves. Whereas if you're saying to trustees, it's a regular Saturday morning meeting, whatever it is, that's their main thing in their agenda for that day. So they'll probably bring a bit more insight and energy.
Yeah, I think that's again some very recognisable points there. I think that of anticipating what the rest of people's lives might be like, and trying to accommodate that within the structure. I think that is a really important sort of cultural message.
We tend to do that for staff. We forget to do that for trustees.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of hands up here. I've got Susan and Shirley. Susan, do you want to come in?
I'm sitting here as a trustee with Fife U3A, and we have a very different situation. We have no staff, we have no premises. The trustees are the staff. We have to be doing everything. And of course, then we have to think very much about hybrid working to deliver the services to our members, which is very much about having face-to-face meetings is what they really want. Obviously, we want to think about hybrid, particularly in terms of what we used to have as regular monthly meetings. And we have found a larger venue to do it in.
Yeah.
The disadvantages are in terms of technology, particularly sound, which is very important. Fact that we're using shared premises, so we don't have control of what's available, and also if we go hybrid, okay, we can collect money for people who appear on the door, but not so easy to collect money from people who zoom in.
Absolutely.
We have used Zoom over the last 18 months, particularly for board meetings, and that's good. And there are still people who'd prefer not to travel as far or not to travel by public transport.
Yeah.
But and obviously using a hybrid method, we can involve people who wouldn't otherwise get to us. Perhaps they're self-isolating or just remote. But I think a lot of people do want to meet in person, and it's how we can best do hybrid is something that we're struggling with.
Yeah, no, and that's going to be a challenge for a lot of folks. We're getting towards the end of our time here, so I'll just bring Shirley in for one last point.
Yes, I just wanted to affirm all those things about John was saying about taking more time to be reflective and thinking about works for people, because I'm with Susan about the connectivity.
Yeah.
But also, one of the things I've noticed is some boards have split. Their relationships got tense and difficulty. The beauty of Zoom or Teams is you can meet one-to-one easily and quickly to help bring people back, to make them feel that they're welcome back. Yeah. So using those things as well as, but also I've noticed people when I go online, they're already meeting, they're already staying on after because they want to connect. So let those things happen. Thank you very much. Very good session.
Thank you. And thanks very much for the comments that are just sort of coming in on the chat. There's some really interesting things there for some reflections there from different kinds of charity. I'd just like to say thanks very much indeed to Stephanie and to John for really interesting contributions. I feel like I've learned a lot here and got a lot of insights, and I hope everyone has. And thanks very much to you for all coming and participating. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.